Final Fantasy XIV is known for having a fantastic story, both as a game in general, but especially as an MMORPG, which is a genre that rarely has its narrative as one of its core focuses. The splendor and scale of 14's story truly took off the 2015 Heavensward expansion, and the absolute masterpiece of a tale would continue on in content updates for almost a year, before finally concluding in a final battle that can only be described as unforgettable for all the right reasons. But with Heavensward's story finally wrapped up in patch 3.3 Revenge of the Horde, the following two patches in the 3.x series had the almost impossible job of following up the sheer perfection of patch 3.3, but also set up the story for Final Fantasy XIV's next expansion, Stormblood, which would be a major shift in tone from the environments and stories told throughout Heavensward. Unfortunately, these patches were almost certainly doomed to fail from the beginning because of their circumstance, and they would not live up to the three patches that had come before them, especially Revenge of the Horde, which it was straight off the heels of. But while these patches do not live up to the 10 out of 10 experience of the previous patches, which, mind you, had a whole expansion of build up to them, Final Fantasy XIV patches 3.4 Soul Surender and 3.5 The Far Edge of Fate are great in their own right. This is one of many reasons to isolate them and give these two patches their own dedicated video without having the previous three cast as big of a shadow over top of them. If it was not already blatantly obvious, this video will cover Final Fantasy XIV patches 3.4 and 3.5. Specifically, this video will be going relatively in depth on their main story quests, to which I will go over what they do well, where they falter, and my general opinion and experiences when I played through these two patches. Now, it should go without saying that this video will contain heavy spoilers, so if you wish to remain unspoiled, I suggest you go play through this part of the game. This video will still be here when you are finished. But for those of you who have played through these patches, and those who simply don't care about spoilers, let's get into it. As always, my name is Lukeidem, and this is So I Played Final Fantasy XIV post Dragonsong. Released on September 18th of 2016, patch 3.4 was the act that had to follow the amazing conclusion of patch 3.3. This patch deals with the Warriors of Darkness and brings their story to a temporary conclusion, not to be dealt with again until Shadowbringers. If this was a single player game, this would simply be a story DLC with the amount of new things that are presented in the 3.4 storyline, but since it's actually an MMO patch, it also comes with a bunch of extra content. This includes things like the final Heavensward raid tier in Alexander the Creator, Grand Company platoons, and apartments. The patch starts out with the Warrior of Light having a nice dinner with Imeric. However, this meal is interrupted by Thancred arriving with a poisoned Alisaie Levier. Despite being poisoned, she manages to relay info about the Warriors of Darkness that she gathered during her unwarranted investigation. Turns out they are already working on the next primal summoning, so the Warrior of Light and co. rush to the XIV village to stop the summoning with only moments to spare before the Warrior of Darkness show up with a very familiar looking elf. I think I've seen this guy before. Anyway, the Warriors of Darkness proceed to give us quite a lot of information about themselves and their goals. While this lore is extremely interesting and very important later on, it is all set up for Shadowbringers, which wasn't even the next expansion. You know how I said that this is the part of the game that is supposed to set up Stormblood? Well, it seems the developers forgot about that part. But basically, the Warriors of Darkness are from the world closest to the source that was destroyed by an overwhelming light after defeating the Ascians and the darkness in their world. But now they've joined forces with the Ascians to spread darkness after they were told it would keep both their world and others from being destroyed. I mean, why they would believe lying pieces of shit like the Ascians? Who knows? But this does set them up as very interesting villains. While they are putting people at risk and doing horrible things, they have been manipulated into thinking that they are actually being heroes that are doing the right thing to maintain the balance across worlds, not only saving their own people, but others as well. They're the first morally gray villains in 14, and you can't help but feel sorry for them, and it made me think about what the Warrior of Light and the Scions would do if they were put in that situation. Anyway, after returning to Ishgard, we are met with a recovered Alisaie who is eager to join us on our mission and is now equipped with clothes that clearly distinguish her from her brother Alphino, which is a fantastic change as I hated the characters looking the same, but also the Charlie and Prodigy set as itself. I still can't believe they want $20 for that shit on the Mog Station. We then head to everyone's favorite place, the Waking Sands, and have a conversation with Urianger. Wait a minute, I feel like I've seen him recently, but that's impossible. Wait, we're going off to kill Titan now? Well, onwards to Lenosha. When we get there with the goal of once again stopping the kobolds from summoning Titan, we meet a young kobold named Gabu that also wants to stop the summoning in order to save his parents from being sacrificed in said summoning. So we join forces with him and head into the navel to confront the kobold chieftain, only to find that Gabu's parents had already been slaughtered. Of course, Gabu becomes furious, as any person would, and his anger ends up being the final piece to summoning Titan. Nicely done, little guy. But seriously, the poor kobold not only failed in saving his parents from being sacrificed, but also accidentally finished the summoning himself. Talk about an unlucky day. Luckily, this incarnation of Titan is a little bitch and we take him out quite easily. But not before Gabu seemingly manages to get himself tempered by the primal. This guy cannot catch a break. That night, Eorzea, Gabu, and the Warrior of Light have a nice moment as they stare up at the stars. We get to know a lot more about Eorzea here and the kind of person she is, and this singular conversation quickly made her my favorite character in the entire game. She's the most well-rounded and endearing personality, and this sequence shows so many different sides of her. These quiet and peaceful moments are rare in FF14, so they are already special, but the way everything is framed here and the fact that for this moment to occur required a tragedy to occur right before it really shows the writer's willingness to tell a much deeper story than most games in its genre. Speaking of tragedies, or rather upcoming tragedies, the Warrior of Darkness and the strangely familiar elf have a meeting and resolve that since they failed with Titan, they would instead kill the Warrior of Light to usher in a calamity, so yeah, that's a thing. But we'll put that on the back burner for now, as some talk about crystals being sent to Garabani to summon a primal eventually turns into learning about a new group within the Alamegan Resistance that is calling themselves the Masks, who are led by an enigmatic man who is called the Griffin. Wait a minute. Garabanium, Alamego, Resistance? Huh, well I'll be damned. This is starting to sound like Stormblood. The Warrior of Light and co. go to a rally of the Griffins to learn more, and end up bumping into the last two Scions who remain unaccounted for. Papalimo the Thaumaturge and Ida the Pugilist. We learn about how they have been aiding the Resistance after getting their help to escape Ul'dah back in 2.5, and we get some info on how the Masks came to prominence within the Resistance and their goals and values. Since we're on the tail of another primal summoning that Papalimo muses might be the Griffin's doing, they set up a meeting with the now known to be fake Griffin under the pretext of joining the cause. Of course, this is actually a sting operation, and once he's surrounded, the fake Griffin immediately starts talking and reveals that they mean to exchange the crystals with the Amalja in exchange for their aid. So we run to the Bowl of Embers to find dead Amalja everywhere in the Warriors of Darkness among the bodies. What is one of the best solo duties in the game then ensues as we fight the Warriors of Darkness, who decide to reveal that they are using hacks and are simply in an ephemeral form much like an Ascian. Luckily, Eorzea has a trump card and summons an ethereal blade that can actually hurt them. But then the Grey Cloud Elf shows up and reveals that it was actually Eorzea the whole time. Huh! Totally didn't figure that one out. But as it would happen, the bastard didn't actually betray us and manages to get everyone to throw themselves into the ethereal sea to speak to the word of Mother. Hydaelyn addresses the Warriors of Darkness and speaks about the first and effectively says, oops, my bad, before freeing Menphilia, who is sent off to the homeworld of the Warriors of Darkness to go solve the tiny problem of their world being destroyed. So she and the Warriors of Darkness leave, and we can forget any of that happened until Shadowbringers, as that battle that we just finished isn't exactly relevant for a while. For the first time since 2.x, everyone else returns to Mor Dhona to discuss events and gets really pissed off at Eorzea for aiding and abetting the Warriors of Darkness. After that, the Scions discuss what they should do and eventually decide to just have everyone do their own thing for now. As the final part of the patch, we get to see the real Griffin having a discussion with the guest about their goals. And of course, who else could this guest be but the Ascian Elidibus? While this is already bad enough on its own, Elidibus gives the Griffin a block of ice containing Nidhogg's eyes. Huh. Maybe throwing two of the most powerful objects in the universe off a bridge wasn't exactly a great idea. So, as is evident, this patch is a lot more densely packed than previous patches, and the same is true for the next one as well. Overall, this patch properly introduces Eorzea into the main cast and sets up both part of Stormblood and Shadowbringers in one fell swoop, which is actually quite impressive. My only complaints about this patch was that it was extremely dense for 11 quests, and that it often felt unfocused and almost rushed. However, the fact that they managed to weave together both the prelude to Stormblood and Shadowbringers so seamlessly is quite outstanding. In terms of new information, this patch carries a lot with it and managed to keep my undivided attention throughout its entirety. While it is a bit of a mess, it is an extremely entertaining patch that feels like you've just played an entire game's worth of content. The final patch in the 3.x series, Patch 3.5 The Far Edge of Fate, released on January 17th of 2017, with Patch 3.55 releasing on February 28th of 2017. Per norm, I'll be condensing these two together for the sake of brevity. The important content additions in this patch include a new CNE trial, Hildebrand stuff, relic stuff, and a new MSQ dungeon. Jumping into the MSQ, Elfno calls all the Scions back to the Rising Stones to discuss who will become the new leader of the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, now that Minfilia is officially out of the picture. The group nominates Alphino for some reason, only for him to remind them of how royally he screwed up with the Crystal Braves before I could stick my head through the screen and remind them myself. Next, they nominate the Warrior of Light, which I thought to be a fantastic idea, but they said they can't because we are off saving the world and fighting primals all the time. 1. Why can't I do both? 2. What kind of leader stays out of the conflict? Literally every good leader in this game is shown to fight on the front lines, and every bad leader is shown to sit back. But anyway, they decide no one should lead, and then a messenger runs in and declares that the Griffin means to spark a war between the Eorzean Alliance and the Garleans occupying Giribania. Specifically, he means to attack the fortress along the Giribanian and Blackshroud border called Baelsar's Wall. The Scions quickly scatter across Eorzea to warn the Grand Company leaders of the Griffin's intent, and all the companies immediately mobilize and head towards Gridania, where a massive strategy is held and everyone voices their ideas and concerns about the next steps. Some of the Scions and our Doman refugee ally Yugiri try to get the Griffin to stop his plan, and the Warrior of Light and Alphino have a meeting with the commanders. Sadly, there is no time for such things, as an explosion occurs atop Baelsar's Wall. A guard rushes in and announces it to be an attack by the Alliance, but since no order to attack was given, it is confirmed that this was indeed a trap. It's up to the Warrior of Light to assault the wall directly, and Baelsar's Wall is a pretty cool dungeon. While we get glimpses at Garlean architecture earlier in the game, Baelsar's Wall is full of it, and it is quite an awesome set piece with how many things are going on at once. And instead of the usual black-clad Garlean guards we are used to slaughtering, this time, things are a bit different as the enemies we are fighting are disguised as soldiers from the Grand Companies. Enemies in allied colors are quite strange to tear through, but it was a nice change of pace. Overall, the dungeon is very cool and very uniquely designed compared to the dungeons before it, but it is the first dungeon in the game to truly suffer from one giant hallway syndrome, which began in Heavensward but is multiplied in most of Stormblood, only slightly being pulled back in Shadowbringers. I think Heavensward had the best balance between the more complex ARR style dungeons and the more linear Stormblood style, but that's just one of the many problems I have with the dungeon design in this game, and honestly that could be a whole video in and of itself. The final boss of Baelsar's Wall is the Griffin, who reveals himself to be Ilberd, the bastard who originally organized and executed the revolt of the Crystal Braves back in 2.x. I never liked that idiot, and getting to finally give him a beatdown was therapeutic in a way. Despite being beaten to a pulp and other Scions joining the fray, Ilberd laughs and states his plan has already been completed. Elsewhere along the wall, Ilberd's accomplices unleash several Magitech killing machines into the armies fighting below and slaughter them with ease. Ilberd then uses the ether coming off the corpses, one of Nidhogg's eyes, and himself as a vessel to summon forth a primal even more destructive than Bahamut. Shit. Why can't Summoner have that thing? Before the Primal can usher in a calamity even worse than the one 5 years prior, Papalimo produces Louisoix's staff and begins to cast the sealing ritual that Louisoix had used at the Battle of Cartano at the end of 1.0. Ida, of course, isn't happy about this, but is forced onto an airship as Papalimo successfully seals himself in the Primal inside a cocoon, making him the most useful Lalafell in Final Fantasy XIV history. But tragically, the Potato Man forgot to cut himself up before jumping into the floating pressure cooker that he had made. And since we didn't get to consume any Lalafellian french fries, I'll have to deduct some points from his death. Once back to safety, the Scions take a moment to speak about Papalimo's death, saying that the Lalafell had the same look in his eyes as Louisoix did on that fateful day. I'm sure this had an emotional impact on legacy players, but by the time I played this part of the game, it was more than 3 years old already, and I hadn't even set foot in any of the coils, so any impact that was supposed to be there was lost on me. Eventually, everyone returns to the Rising Stones and vows to find a way to kill the Primal inside the cocoon, since the seal won't hold forever. The Eorzean Alliance soon after calls a meeting with the Scions and good old Cid, while a strange samurai arrives on a tiny boat in Vesper Bay. You see, that's Mr. Stormblood, and he's going to be responsible for setting up half of Stormblood. But back to the meeting with the Eorzean Alliance, yeah, nothing comes of it. Except for Nero Tolskeva, who invites himself in and recommends using the ancient Allegan method of letting a giant robot do everything for you. Yeah, I'm starting to get an understanding of why they died out. So we go to find Omega, who is the said giant robot, and luckily enough, it's only a stone throw away from the Rising Stones. Of course, no one trusts Nero. After all, he is a former Garlean engineer and ended up covered in slime and crystals in the Crystal Tower raids. And you just don't trust people covered in slime and crystals. The Garlean part's not a big deal though. Back with a strange samurai man, Eorzea picked him up off the street and brought him inside, where the samurai immediately recognized Yugiri, and it quickly explains that she has come to fetch her so they can return to Doma to aid their lord. Yugiri explains that she feels honor-bound to help the Scions, to which the samurai, who we now know is named Gotetsu, protests. But the minute he learns that we are killing Imperials, he is more than happy to join the cause. Back at the Warrior of Light and Sid's group, they arrive at the site of Omega and bump into a group of Garlean soldiers, one of which becomes a recurring character throughout Stormblood that is pretty much Orange from the first part of Code Geass. Though, unlike Orange later on in Code Geass, this dude does nothing except get beat up all the time. I like him. When they finally get to the controls for Omega and prep it for activation, Sid chooses to let Ida decide if they unleash it upon Garabania and the Primal, giving her the authority since she hails from Alamigo, which is part of the region. She hesitates for a moment, which pissed me off as I wanted to see a giant robot punch a dragon in the face, and as if she was hearing my thoughts, she punches the activation button, sending the robot flying off to the cocoon. I was hyped for what would hopefully be a good battle, and the only sad thing is that this is the peak of any incarnation of Ida's character. As if on cue, the Primal bursts from the cocoon and the Domans nearby start referring to it as Shinryu. But before it can do anything, Omega shows up in front of it and engages it in a super flashy battle with tons of explosions everywhere that light up the night sky. It doesn't top Hraesvelgr vs Nidhogg, but it's a pretty great fight for a one-off. Sadly, the monster and robot vanish across the horizon, and the group at the controls has no idea what happened to Omega or Shinryu, as the signal conveniently went out during the battle. But hey, in the interest of saving time, I'll just tell you how it went. Omega is the Stormblood 8-man raid series. For the final time before Stormblood, the Alliance leaders meet and decide to use recent events to their advantage and gain the aid of the Alamigan resistance in case war with the Empire breaks out, and they also start to move into Garabania with the ultimate goal of wresting Alamigo from the Empire's clutches. Meanwhile, with the Scions, Ida reveals that she is not actually the real Ida, but is her sister named Elise. Elise had taken up Ida's mask and name 6 years earlier as the original Ida had died, though 6 years means that canonically, she is the only Ida the Warrior of Light has ever known. Turns out, Papalimil's final request to her was to go and walk her own path. Thus, Elise decides to throw the mask and false name away and fight for Alamigo's freedom to preserve her family's legacy. You think that the Scions would be quite upset and surprised about this revelation, but surprisingly, none of them really seem to care. The final scenes of this patch show Yugiri and Gotetsu departing back to Doma now that Yugiri's commitment to the Scions has come to an end, and she is honor-bound to return to the Far East now that her role has been fulfilled. Meanwhile, the Imperial Viceroy of Garabania is introduced, and they show a great interest in the fate of Omega and Shinryu. With that, patch 3.5 is wrapped up, and the vast majority of the setup for Stormblood is done as well. While it is a very dense patch with many different plot points and wars being shown or alluded to, Stormblood itself has the most plot points and subplot points of any of the expansion, so 3.5 serves as a good introduction to the layered story that Stormblood would be telling going forward. We meet a lot of important characters in the patch who are both allies and enemies, as well as lose some allies during the fighting, and 3.5 finally puts the Crystal Brave story in the dirt once and for all, which was something long overdue. But while it may be overwhelming to many, this patch managed to set up all three parts of Stormblood's story, as well as the side content that would be in post-Stormblood, primarily the Omega raids. While not quite as good as the three patches that precede them, the later half of the 3.x patches that consist of patches 3.4 and 3.5 do a great job of setting up Stormblood and its side content, and even the Shadowbringers expansion that would follow after Stormblood. While being very dense in story content to the point where it is sometimes hard to keep track of everything, 3.4 and 3.5 are entertaining all the way through and never fall into the realm of tedium thanks to their fast-paced and fast-changing story. Despite being attached at the hip to early 3.x and Heavensward itself, these patches make a clear distinction between the end of the Heavensward era and the start of the Stormblood era, whether it be for better or for worse. Well, I did not expect this video to turn out as long as it has, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. With this, we are officially done with covering the Heavensward era, though I do eventually plan to come back and cover the Chronicles of a New Era and Anima weapons in the future. To end it off, as always, my name is Lakaitem, thank you for watching, and have a good day.